Hi, this is Natasha Wickenheiser, and today I'll be reviewing Tom Standage's most recent book, Writing on the Wall, Social Media the First 2,000 Years, which was published in 2013 by Bloomsbury Publishing. Now, as a millennial, I fit the bill for Standage's target audience. Not only have I grown up alongside our developing and emerging computer technology, I also participate in a culture where social media and communication technologies are integral to our everyday lives as well as our communication practices with others. With this audience in mind, Standage's book responds to our cultural assumption that social media is something new to the digital age, something that past generations can't possibly understand because they haven't grown up with access to our digital technology. Standage negates this assumption by using historical narrative accounts about communication technologies and their uses within social networks to argue that social media has existed and functioned in communities for over 2 millennia. And, much like the digital social media we use today, social media systems, regardless of the technologies used, have always been complexly dialogic and controversial. Each chapter of Writing on the Wall narrates social media's presence in a variety of time periods, from Rome in 1st century BC, 16th and 17th century England, 18th century France, and 19th and 20th century America. Standage traces the development and use of Western European communication technology within social networks. For example, he details the Roman practice of writing, copying, and circulating letters on papyrus paper, explaining that it was culturally expected for Roman citizens to add content and share copies of their letters with other people in their social circles. Similarly, Standage narrates the emergence of coffee houses in the 17th century, which served as a public space for intellectuals from various classes to gather and discuss new scientific advancements. This social practice then led to the development of scientific journals, allowing scientists to engage in asynchronous conversations across larger distances. And, as literacy rates increased, so did the public's consumption of printed mass media such as the pamphlets and newspapers distributed in the 17th and 18th centuries. Standage follows this media development into our most recent past, discussing the emergence of radio, television, the internet, blogging, and contemporary social media spaces such as Facebook and Twitter. At the surface, each of these mediated technology practices seem different and unrepresentative of social media, especially as we know it today. However, Standage attempts to link these various media systems by showcasing his own definition of social media. He argues that the various social media systems discussed in Writing on the Wall are two-way conversational environments in which information passes horizontally from one person to another along social networks, rather than being delivered vertically from an impersonal central source. In other words, Standage defines social media as space that invites conversation. With this definition in mind, it becomes easier to understand how the acts of circulating letters or gathering in coffee houses can function as social media practices. In his epilogue, Standage admits that some of the analogies between ancient and modern forms of social media are not perfect, and I agree with him. As a reader, I struggle to accept his examples of mass media as social media. Yes, a person can read a newspaper, listen to the radio, or watch something on television, and that experience can prompt them to engage in conversations with others. However, the technology itself is limited as a space for conversation because participation in the conversations that take place using those technologies is very much restricted to those who have the appropriate privilege, credentials, or social connections. There is still a sense of the top-down communication model that Standage's social media definition seeks to subvert. Despite Standage's occasional stretch between defining and applying social media in historical contexts, Writing on the Wall is still an engaging, thought-provoking book to read. First, his definition of social media is eye-opening. We often think of social media as an immediate communication form that connects us to both our intimate social networks and the public at large. However, Standage invites readers to reassess and expand these beliefs. His argument invites us to perceive all communication practices, regardless of the technologies used, as social in nature. Whether the leaders of Westeros send messages via ravens, teenagers pass notes to their friends in middle school, sculptors design public art, or scholars gather at academic conferences, all communication interactions create a space for conversation. This understanding can reshape the ways readers think about social media, as well as their personal communication practices. Standage helps his readers understand this message by using accessible historical narratives to emphasize his argument. His use of narrative makes it easy to enjoy reading his book because, well, quite frankly, narratives are more fun to read than texts that are dense with citations and convoluted academic language. Each chapter reads like a mini story about the development of a given century's mediated technology. For example, Chapter 8 recounts social media's role in shaping the French Revolution. Standage explains the strong culture of censorship that existed in 18th century France, then shares the story of citizens gossiping about French aristocrats using clever rhymes that were circulated and expanded by each new listener. He goes on to recount the humorous process that French police officers went through to identify the original author of these rhymes, which essentially led the officers on a continuous witch hunt because everyone simply passed off the blame to the person who shared the rhyme with them. As a reader, I enjoyed the narrative structure. It was almost as if I was reading a collection of historical fiction short stories with a centralized theme of using social media to incite political and social change. That said, there are limitations to Standage's use of narrative structure. By relying primarily on narratives, Standage does not take full advantage of all the opportunities to emphasize his argument. He simply leaves readers to extract these lessons from the narratives on their own. Granted, readers are perfectly capable of identifying connections between Standage's definition of social media, the historical narratives he presents, and contemporary social media. However, Standage does not make these connections explicit, with the exception of a sentence or two at the end of each chapter. Now, I acknowledge that writing on the wall is not intended for academic audiences, let alone scholars of rhetoric and composition, but it seems to me that he could communicate his arguments about technology, social media, and communication across social networks more explicitly if he integrated his arguments within the narrative structure, as opposed to briefly tacking them on at the end of each chapter. A final limitation of writing on the wall that I want to mention is Standage's emphasis on Western European social media practices. Granted, he does acknowledge that Eastern countries like China use social media, but these discussions are framed around contemporary digital social media. There is no mention of how social media practices developed historically in Eastern cultures, which seems to irrationally imply that all social media technologies were developed as part of Western European culture and then shared with Eastern cultures, who had been living without mediated technologies for all of that time. Although the topic is worthy of its own book, I would have liked to read a chapter or two addressing social media from an Eastern perspective to help readers understand how social media, like all communication, is culturally situated. Overall, I really enjoyed reading Standage's Writing on the Wall. Not only did it challenge the way I'm defining social media, it also reinforced my understanding that all technology, especially for communication purposes, builds upon the previous technology available. And although this book has a few limitations in its argumentative structure and cultural scope, I highly recommend it to individuals who are interested in communication, social media, or mediated technologies. Standage definitely presents an engaging argument and topic that leaves you feeling like you've learned something about the way that the world and technology works, which is pretty cool. Additionally, scholars in the rhetoric and composition or computers and writing fields may find this book interesting. Although Writing on the Wall is not academic by nature, it does present a historical framework for social media that scholars could re-examine from a rhetorical perspective. Regardless of your academic and your personal interests, writing on the wall is sure to be intellectually stimulating, engaging, and fun to read. Definitely go check it out.